This is the second day of our evidential hearings. Before we begin, can I say to those in the public spaces at the back that you may use your electronic devices to communicate to the outside world what you hear and see in this hearing room, but only once 10 minutes have elapsed. You may not use such devices for photography or for recording what goes on in here. There is a notice on the desk in front of you, I think, which sets it out more fully. Yes, Mr. Fernandez.
Thank you, Chairman.
So sorry, we're beginning by having a short... forgive me, sorry, let's start again. Ms. Leicester, I understand you wish to be affirmed, is that, that right?
Yes.
Then I'll ask Mr. Fernandez to do that, and then you'll be asked some questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, just before I do that, just do an introduction on health and safety.
Yes.
One second. So welcome to day 2 of evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez and I am the hearings manager. Just to confirm, there is no fire alarm testing expected today, so if the fire alarm goes off, please follow the fire exit signs and make your way to the muster point, which is the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On arrival at the muster point, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and who will be keeping a register of all attendees. The fire marshals will also be responsible for letting everyone know when it's safe to return in liaison with representatives from the Thistle Hotel. I'll now swear yourself in.
She's going to affirm.
Affirm. Thank you. Please repeat after me. I solemnly declare and affirm.
I solemnly declare and affirm
That the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Hampson.
Can you give the inquiry your full name, please?
Elizabeth Amanda Tate Leicester.
Thank you. You have provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 11th of February 2022. Can you confirm that the contents of that witness statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Your assistance was sought in the main about the activities undertaken at the Workers' Revolutionary Party Education Centre at White Meadows, where you were resident with your family between approximately 1975 and I think 1978. Before I ask you a few questions about that, I just want to ask you a few general questions about the Workers' Revolutionary Party. I just first want to establish a very brief history of your involvement with the WRP that you have set out in your witness statement. You and your then husband, Roy Battersby, had been part of the predecessor organisation of the WRP, the Socialist Labour League, is that right?
Yes.
And you worked on its paper, the SLL paper, the Workers' Press, which later became the paper of the WRP, is that right?
Yes.
And that was a paper which Roy Battersby also contributed to, is
Yes,
that
from
right?
time to time.
And was that a full-time role that you undertook at the paper?
Yes, until I had my first child.
The WRP developed out of the Socialist Labour League in 1973, is that right?
Yes.
You and Roy Battersby hosted left-wing discussion groups at your London flat, is that right? Which were which involved other left-wing figures in the film, television, and industry, is that right?
Yes, a large number of people came to discussions every week.
You were also active in your local branch of the WRP, the Outer London branch, is that right?
Yes, it was an unusual branch. We didn't participate in the same activities as everyone else because some of it was kind of, these were very public figures, and it was felt that we had to be a little bit careful.
And Roy Battersby was a member of the WRP Central Committee, is that right?
Yes, he was.
You and Mr. Battersby moved to White Meadows in 1975 with your family
Yes,
and remained there till 1978 approximately.
yeah, 77, 78, yes.
And Mr. Battersby was the Central Committee's representative in charge of the premises, is that right?
Yes,
Initially to oversee the renovations, but then involved in the running of the events there and the organisation of and the security of the educational courses that were undertaken there, is that right?
yes.
With that background in mind, can I ask you now just a few very general questions about the WRP? The ultimate aim of the WRP, you set out in your witness statement, was to establish a socialist state, is that right?
Yes, but always we were very internationalist, and we were aware, if you know anything about Trotskyism, that was one of Trotsky's main tenets, that this was an international question.
Was that an aim that was openly avowed by the WRP?
Yeah, sure.
Was it an aim that was set out in WRP publications like the Workers' Press?
Yes, certainly, particularly political statements. I mean, the paper would cover all kinds of issues, industrial issues, international issues, and then it wouldn't necessarily always be there. But when there were political statements about a particular event, then it would be very open that we thought that socialism was the way forward.
The WRP also had a chain of bookshops, is that right?
Yes, it did.
And left-wing socialist literature sold at those bookshops?
All kinds of literature, not just left-wing, all kinds of, they were very broad-based bookshops with all kinds of things.
A film production business also owned by the WRP?
Yes, we did.
And what sort of films were produced by the WRP?
I was trying to think about this. The actual archive is now at the British Film Institute. So I was trying to remember, because we're talking 50 years ago almost.
Yes, of course.
But I can remember certainly a film in the north of Ireland about the events in Ireland, which were, of course, very, very lively in the late 60s and early 70s. A film about the Portuguese Revolution, which was also happening. Films about events that we put on. For instance, we had some very large, well-attended by thousands of people, pageants of labour history, events about working class history, about British history, etc. And we would have been filming those as well. But as I say, the archive is now in the British Film Institute.
Right, thank you. And also, you've already covered this, but in political statements, you were entirely open about your aims as a socialist state. And in fact, you've supplied an election manifesto that makes that absolutely stark.
Yes.
And I'll take you to that in a moment, if I may. I want to now ask you a few questions about what the WRP did to advance its aim to establish a socialist state. One difference with its predecessor organisation is that the Socialist Labour League sought to do that by means of election of a Socialist Labour government, but the WRP sought to do something slightly different. You have said in your witness statement that the WRP sought to build revolutionary leadership. What does that actually mean in practice?
I think we were trying in various statements to say what actually you've heard already to this inquiry, that the job of revolution is the job of the majority of people, of the mass of the working class, not a small group of people. And in our statements, I think we were trying to say there is another way of organizing society, there's another way of living that can actually improve the lives of everybody, that isn't based on private profit. So it was in a certain way propaganda to try and get in discussions, and that's why we stood in elections, to have that discussion. We can do things differently. But of course it didn't mean that a small group of people would be doing that, just that we might be putting forward those ideas for discussion.
You mentioned that that's why you stood in those elections, in order that you could have that conversation publicly. And I think it's right, 1974 general election, 10 candidates, 1979 election, 60 candidates,
Yes. Yeah.
which also gave you I think, a right to have a televised...
Yes, Corin Redgrave did a televised election broadcast.
Thank you. Is this also right? The WRP didn't believe that parliamentary representation in itself would bring about a socialist state.
Yes, that's right, that there are limits to the form of democracy, as important as it is. There are limits to the parliamentary system.
And in fact, that's made plain in the election manifesto. If you can just very briefly look, please, at UCPI 50-34745, please. That's extremely tiny. The column I want to look at, please, is the first column, halfway down. No illusions in Parliament is the heading. Sorry, a little bit further up, please. Thank you. Which makes it quite clear that the parliamentary process is not going to be terribly helpful ultimately in setting up a socialist state. In fighting for a socialist programme in this election, we know it cannot be won through the ballot box. Parliament is a major instrument of the capitalist state machine for the defence of private ownership and the oppression of the working class. The election itself will not resolve anything for the working class. Socialism can only be achieved by mobilising the strength of the working class independent of and against the crisis-ridden capitalist state and its parliamentary relics. The Labour Party and Conservative Party, who tie the working class to the parliamentary road, are playing the game with the Tories and their capitalist backers. When our candidates are elected to Parliament, they will fight to expose it for what it is and to mobilise the working class on a socialist programme for the taking of state power.
I think by a slip of the tongue you said Conservative when it reads Communist.
Gosh, I'm so sorry. That's my poor transcription. I'm awfully sorry. It was rather late at night I was doing it. Sorry, so sorry. That was a slip of the tongue. You have told us that the purpose of engaging in parliamentary process was for publicity of your the WRP's views. Is that right?
Yes, but also to encourage people to discuss themselves and think about these issues. It wasn't just about us. It was about general work in the working class around all these issues.
Thank you. If not through the parliamentary process, can I ask you just to establish how the WRP thought socialism could be achieved? The WRP had the All Trades Union Alliance, a sort of an organisation sort of parallel to the trades union organisation. Is that right? That
it was an organisation for trade unionists who might not want to join the WRP,
yes,
but who nonetheless wanted to discuss these issues, to organise, as I say, and to find ways of developing solidarity with each other.
And was that a method of getting your message across through the trades unions?
Oh, certainly. I think we focused a lot. I mean, if you think about the 70s, it was an extraordinary time. I mean, there were millions of strike days in the 70s. Many of the strikes were against the wishes of some of the trade union leaders. There was a real upsurge of workplace democracy, all kinds of discussions going on. So it's quite a different time from now. And I think that's what has to be remembered in this and in that context. And certainly we worked, but we worked as genuine trade unionists. It wasn't a case of infiltrating trade unions. It was a case of you were in the union that was appropriate to where you worked, and then you argued and fought for your issues and with everybody else, because it was a maelstrom of discussion and action at that point.
Thank you. The WRP also participated in highly organised demonstrations, and you have set out in your witness statement the WRP aversion to violence on the streets. Is that right?
Violence, what we would have called adventurist, rightly or wrongly, we didn't engage in on the streets. It's a different question if you ask about if it's ever the right of people who are attacked to defend themselves. That would be different.
I'm
Yes.
going to touch on that in a moment, but you set out in your witness statement that you had an aversion to individual terrorism, adventurism, which means the confrontation on the street between the left wing and the right wing, such
Yes.
as engagement by the SWP or rioting. You say this in your witness statement, paragraph 27, we certainly look back at the Russian Revolution as an inspiration, an example of legitimate violence conducted by the mass of the working people in the face of oppression within an invasion from without. Can you explain what you meant by that? That might provide the bridge about the violence that you possibly envisaged.
Well, again, without discussing Russian history at great length, that was a particular upsurge of millions and millions of people. That revolution was attacked from without by Britain, etc., and they were legitimately trying to defend, what the mass of people had fought for and continued to fight for. So if you're talking about mass movements, that's what I think would mean, and that's what we'd be thinking of, not individual action, but actually a point at which, and we were vague about it. I don't think I understood precisely what we meant by that, quite frankly, looking back, how that would pan out. It certainly wasn't going to be like Russia. It was certainly not in the context of World War I and all the rest of it. We knew that, and the difference in technologies and the difference in all sorts of things. But I think, personally speaking, I wasn't clear what that actually meant. It was more about people have the right, if there's a mass mobilization, to actually fight and defend themselves. So it is vague for me, certainly.
Can the WRP in the 1970s be summarised in this way? At the time, you were striving for a socialist state, but you were using constitutional and non-violent means in order to advance your aims.
Yeah, certainly nothing illegal at all.
Thank you. I want to move on now, please, to White Meadows. It was purchased as a drama, history and literature study centre by Corinne Redgrave. Was it ever intended to be used as such, drama, history and literature study, or was that simply to avoid calling it what it in fact was, which was a college of Marxist education?
I think there was a large component of that being the case. As I said, we organised, not me personally, but the people from that world organised all kinds of very moving, powerful performances, which were attended by thousands and thousands of people and involved a very wide group of people from that world. So yes, there would have been an element, and certainly one of the first groups of people who came, I think I said that in my statement, to attend the College of Marxist Education were, by and large, the people who'd been coming to the regular Friday discussions. Just an aside, if anybody knows Trevor Griffith's play called The Party, it was based on those meetings and those discussions. So I think there would have been an element of that, but overwhelmingly it was for the study of Marxism. And I think I said why we called it that at first. Concerned by attacks from the National Front, concerned that it would be very alarming to a local rural community. So that was called that until the police raid, of course, when it was all over the newspapers, who we were and what we were. And then there was absolutely no point in not calling it the College of Marxist Education.
Yes. The courses at White Meadows, you say in your witness statement, were largely for WRP members, young socialists and members of the All Trade Union Alliance, but it was also advertised in a daily paper. That's in the Workers' Press, it was advertised?
It was in the Workers' Press, yeah.
And how would a non-WRP member obtain a place on the course? If they saw that advertisement, how would they go about it? Can you remember?
They would have had their Workers' Press delivered by people from the local branch, and they would have known who people were, and they would have asked them if they were interested to say, I'd like to attend.
Right. And so non-WRP members were welcome to attend?
Yeah, I don't know that many did. And of course, I can't say for sure,
Right.
actually, but they would be welcomed, yes.
I now just want to take you to the White Meadows report itself, please. UCPI 5012240, please. This is a report which looks like a compilation report. It's thought to be authored by one of the undercover officers who infiltrated the WRP HN298, although he's not entirely clear that it was. Second page, please. The report is dated February 1976, and the centre, we understand, opened in the summer of 1975. Is that
right
right?
at the end of the summer, yes.
And so by the time this report is written, it hadn't been open even for a year. Is that right?
Yeah.
You set out in your statement that it's broadly accurate. There are two relatively minor corrections. One is that, which perhaps I'll take you to in real time, but the first of all, in that first paragraph, the writer of this report indicates that since its opening in the summer of 1975, 900 students had attended the centre. Is that an accurate figure, do you think?
I don't know where that figure came from, and I couldn't work it out when I was thinking that the most we could accommodate would be 60 at a time, and some weeks there might have been 10 people there. So
Right.
I don't know where that came from, which also leads me to other things in that report, which I hope I get a chance to say about where was he
course.
getting this information. And I noticed that Peter Collins, who's another HN who gave evidence, was called very close to the Central Committee, and I think some of the stuff in this report must have come through other routes. He certainly wouldn't have got it from attending White
Right.
Meadows.
Right. And so you say, although it could accommodate 60, did it ever accommodate 60?
Oh, at the beginning, when a lot of members went and made plans, but then you'd been once, you didn't go again for
Yeah.
some time. People had work, people had families, so we catered for children. We had a lot of children, small children coming who weren't in school. But, you couldn't keep that up week after week. And also, with a membership of a few thousand, probably,
Yeah.
you aren't going to be able to. That's why the 900 seems to me
Okay.
unreal, but I don't know.
Paragraph 2 of the report gives information about the purchase price and renovation costs and insurance value of the house following those renovations. Are those details that were available to you as a resident of White Meadows?
I might have known what the place cost to buy. I wouldn't particularly have known about insurance costs. I wouldn't have known about renovation costs. Roy Battersby would have known, if he probably doesn't remember now, but he would have known.
Yeah.
But at the time, I had no reason particularly. And as I said, I don't know where these figures came from. They would certainly have not come from an opening discussion to students at the school.
Okay.
So they've come from somewhere else.
And can you think of where they might have come
Well,
from?
as I say, I can't help but feeling that there's another undercover agent involved here because he said he was close to the Central Committee, HN 303.
Okay.
So I can only imagine that. Or, of course, from other security organizations like MI5, which we are sure were also busy in the WRP.
Thank you. It's also in that. Sorry, not in that paragraph. The paragraph 3. It indicates that workmen attend the White Meadows Centre on occasion to perform small amounts of renovation, and these were WRP members. Well, why were the workmen required to be WRP members? Was that a requirement?
No, it wasn't a requirement. We'd been very, very involved in the campaigning around the building workers who'd been imprisoned. The Shrewsbury 2, we had organised a march, which actually Roy led, from Wigan down to London to object to what had happened to the building workers after that strike when they were charged with conspiracy laws from the Victorian era. And so there was a large group of if you like, workmen, as he called them, who were around, friendly, etc., and very willing to help. So it wasn't an obligation. A number of them would have been, of course, but wasn't necessary.
A large part of this report deals with the security measures employed at White Meadows. Whilst it's fair to say that the WRP was open about its ambitions and campaigned openly at general elections, is it also fair to say it was a security-conscious organisation?
Oh, absolutely, it was, yes, and rightly so, as it turns out.
I just want to sort of supply some of the context in which we're going to be looking at the security measures employed by the WRP at White Meadows. This was a time of great hostility between the National Front, the far right, and left-wing groups. You say in your statement there was a general press interest in the activities of the Socialist Labour League and then the WRP, which you felt was hostile to your aims. And White Meadows had been the subject of a police raid in September 1975, very shortly after the centre had opened, is that right?
Yes.
So it's in that context we're looking at the writing of this report. Were there security measures in place prior to that police raid?
Well, there would have been some security, but nothing like what after the raid.
Right, thank you. You say at your paragraph 49 of your witness statement that under the you had attended a summer camp set up by the Socialist Labour League, attended by hundreds of members and their families, and there was a concern that that was going to be raided, and you were sent back to London with documents which might have been seized during any raid. What sort of documents that were you taking back? What sort of things were you worried about?
Membership lists, financial information, what any political party will have that's not necessarily for the rest of the world to see. But the context of that event was that picture on the front page of the Daily Telegraph taken from a helicopter, which I say in my statement, I think, which was warning about some terrible threat from our organisation. I mean, that was the context.
Right.
So, of course, there was alarm to be on the front page of the Daily Telegraph at that point. For a left-wing group, wasn't a happy thing.
Just to take you through the security measures that were employed by the White Meadows at the time of the writing of this report, there was first a personal search of each student and his luggage. And in fact, one of the errors you point out within this report is that Roy Battersby would search the men, but you would search the women. Is that right?
Yes.
And the search was specifically for offensive weapons, cameras, tape recorders, and any names, addresses, or telephone numbers written down. What was your anxiety about those items?
We were alarmed, particularly after the police raid, that there would be any excuse to actually, any kind of provocation to put us at risk, frankly. And as I say, we weren't necessarily wrong. If you read, again, Roy Battersby's statement, which is a witness statement, I know, though he's not here in person, he describes in detail how that raid took place and how the Observer treated it and the libel case. It was a huge experience for all of us at the time. So we were very concerned that there'd be nothing, that might have indicated that it was an undercover officer, and of course we missed that, but that they had anything illegal, anything dangerous, anything that might compromise us, information that could be sloshing around. We'd be very careful about that because of that police raid and the concern that it was going to happen again or some such thing, and a concern as well about being bugged, and bugs were found. So it was in that context that this quite it's intensive security was arranged.
Students were also warned to be careful about what they said in the house, and you've mentioned the finding of bugging device, I think. What sort of thing were the anxieties about? What sort of things might have been said that would have felt to be that might have compromised you? Can you imagine?
I don't know. I think we would have been more concerned with individual people and their, being identified because of the blacklisting that was going on. Roy himself was the victim of a blacklist at the BBC, and he knew that. And so there would be a concern about that, and other people, obviously, in all sorts of other industries were also being blacklisted, which we know now. It wasn't just the television world. Certainly building workers were at risk in a big way at this point. So there would have been a concern about that. That would have been the main concern, really. There was nothing illegal happening there, and nobody would have had any access to anything that was. But it was just a general atmosphere of be careful, be mindful, because probably it's being listened to.
And you mentioned in your witness statement that, in fact, in the report, it mentions that the students were enjoined not to refer to each other by their surname, and you mentioned in your witness statement that identifiable details were a matter of anxiety because you might have had individuals coming from other countries which had fascist regimes, for example.
And there were. Spanish, Portuguese, Greek. All those countries in the early 70s had fascist dictatorships, and we were extremely concerned for those people that they not be identifiable, and they were coming from time to time.
Other security measures employed at the centre, students were warned that the internal pay telephone was bugged and they had to seek permission to use it. They could be taken to an outside telephone but couldn't leave the garden without permission. All contact with neighbours or any other visitor were to be referred to Roy Battersby, and there was a patrol every 15 minutes of the centre between midnight and 7 a.m. This is all reported in the undercover report. Does the same explanation go for those security measures? This was a response to the police raid in September and the negative press coverage, matters of that nature.
But also the rise of the National Front and organisations such as that in a rural area, which, who knows what was going on. We didn't know people's politics at all. So it was also that the right-wing threat, because they, as far as we were concerned, they were the violent ones.
Also set out in the report is the contingency plan to be put in place in the event of a police raid, which was that the Clapham headquarters of the WRP should be contacted without delay. And I think a 10-pence piece left in the telephone in order that there was always money to make that telephone call if necessary. What was the purpose of that? Why would the Clapham headquarters of WRP need to be notified immediately?
Well, that's where the substantial leadership, if you like, of the WRP would have been based, where the paper was based, where there would be an ability to inform everybody else throughout the country that this was happening, which would have been important, and to share that information very quickly, which we couldn't have done from a call box in Derbyshire. So I think it was the dissemination of that information and I suppose a warning to others of what was happening if something like that did happen again.
Right. Is it your view, I think you refer to this in your witness statement, that it is partly that security consciousness of the WRP which drove the police interest in the WRP and what was going on at White Meadows?
That was a guess, that they found it interesting, which I think they do say in various reports, that there was no public order threat, but a lot of security measures in place.
Can we just briefly, please, go back to have the report back on screen, please? UCPI 50122240. Thank you. And scroll down, please, to paragraph 20. yes, at the bottom of that page and then over the page. Paragraph 20 sets out the subjects taught at White Meadows during the educational course that this person attended. You can see at the bottom there, subjects for discussion quite straightforward, innocuous, included dialectical, historical, materialism, capital and philosophy. The principles, these subjects were carried out in conjunction with readings from Marx's Capital volume, Engels, Anti-Düring, Engels, etc., etc., etc. Is that typical of courses run at White Meadows, that set of subjects being taught?
Yes, certainly that would have been the core of the discussions, yes.
Can I just ask you about the advertisement that appeared in the workers' press? Would it have made it clear that it was these sorts of subjects that were being taught during the
I can't
course at
remember,
White
to
Meadows?
tell you the truth. I can't remember. Probably not. Probably somebody would have had to chat, as I said,
Right.
to whoever they knew, whoever was delivering their paper, to say what kind of things are happening next week or the week after or whatever. So it would vary a bit, and there would be history as well as philosophy. This is obviously very heavily, he's been at one where there was philosophy. I
Yes.
wonder how he got on with Lenin's volume 38. Not an easy read. But anyway, it could have been more historically based at certain times too.
Right,
But
thank
actually,
you.
this is what he went to. That makes me laugh.
The subjects for discussion are described by this individual as straightforward and innocuous. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, again, it depends on whether you consider Karl Marx straightforward and innocuous and Lenin straightforward and innocuous. If he means, which I presume he does, there was nothing about public disorder, nothing illegal, nothing that anybody couldn't anywhere, if they wanted to pick up one of these books, do in a totally legal way, then yes, that's innocuous.
And we know, of course, that shortly after this report, SDS deployments into the WRP came to an end. Finally, this from me, the WRP were infiltrated for a period of about 2 years or so, and the place where you lived and the place where you worked was infiltrated, was spied on. What's your reaction to that?
This was my home and the home of 2 small children and my partner. And I think it's outrageous, actually, when there was absolutely no reason for it, which many of these reports from Central Bank, they keep saying it. They're not interested in disorder, but we're going to keep an eye on them anyway. And I feel it was an excuse which has come up from a lot of the opening statements for the SDS to continue. There was no reason for anybody to be there. I think, as I recall, that Peter Collins was actually longer in the WRP, and I think it's a shame that we aren't going to get a chance to really explore that because we're not core participants. We aren't seeing all the documents, nor is the inquiry, presumably. And I think that's a real loss to the inquiry because he was there longer. He's quoted as saying he was close to the Central Committee, and he's the one who said he was infiltrated into the National Front. Now, to me, that's an extraordinary statement. I knew nothing of that. And my colleagues and comrades who I'm still in touch with know nothing of that. And to me, that's it's amazing if that's true. So I think there's a lot more to look at here. And the other thing, I'm going to just finish this one point, is that this guy, this was his swan song, it says. So this is his last little piece of work, although he's been bopping around all kinds of organizations before this, I see, and very busy. But he was actually instructed not to go to White Meadows. The guess being that it was a very sensitive place because of the police raid and the libel trial that was going on and all the rest of it. But he went anyway. And it's just not the case that he couldn't have pulled out, which I think is what he implied. Of course he could. People did. People got sick. People had families who were sick. They couldn't go. Somebody died. We couldn't enforce people going. He didn't have to go. He could have come with all kinds of reasons. So you can't help but feel that something else is going on here too in terms of the security services, broadly speaking, that isn't just the SDS and public order. And I feel that quite strongly, that that's a real question I would have about his evidence.
Okay, thank you. Ms Leicester, I've got no further questions for you. I don't want I just want to give you a brief opportunity to say anything else you want to add to your evidence now. You said earlier that you hoped you were going to get an opportunity to say a few things. I don't want to shut you out of that opportunity.
Okay, thanks. Well, I've just said one, which I think is a real interesting, and as I said, the interconnections between the different security services. They're kind of fighting with each other. The SDS trying to justify its existence in a way that I think was unjustifiable is one of the things I wanted to say, and about the fact that he went to White Meadows anyway, in spite of being ordered not to. And I think there's the hand of somebody else behind that, unless he was just a rogue, which is possible as well, who did what he wanted to do, as some of them seemed certainly to do. So that was one of the things that I was concerned about. I was concerned as well, as I've already said, that there were actually, Peter Collins was longer in the WRP, and it seems to me we're well worth exploring further, which is why we hoped we'd be core participants, that we would get a chance, as would the inquiry, to really delve a bit deeper into what was going on there, and the sort of limits of the inquiry, which we're kind of frustrated by, and the fact that we first contacted the inquiry 2 years ago, and we still had to fight to get even this far as we've got. So that was another thing I wanted to talk about, the sort of catch-22 that we've been in. I think I've got through the main things that I wanted to say. I didn't probably answer your question about revolution, which is a tricky one, beyond to say that I wasn't really clear. But I think what we wanted a more just society. We want a society that was based on the needs of the majority and not private profit. And that's really what the message was about, and that's what I still feel. And I think that, maybe the methods and some of the language is, of the 1970s, but that determination that that's what we wanted, a better world and a better society. And it's hard to face the fact of that infiltration by the forces of the state into a group of people who, the vast majority, except for the undercover officers, believed in that. So I think that's what I would want to convey.
Thank you very much. I've got no further questions for you.
Do either the Commissioner's team or the DL have any questions now that they would wish to have raised by Ms. Battersby?
No, thank you, sir.
Thank you. In which case we're going to curtail our usual procedure of adjourning for 20 minutes to allow those off stage, as it were, to be able to forward any questions that they might wish to have raised, which means that I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, to conduct your re-examination, if any, now. But if you tell me there's a good reason not to, I'll gladly listen and if persuaded, agree.
So I have nothing to ask in re-examination.
No, thank you. Ms. Leicester, I hope I can call you Ms. without offence.
No offence.
Would you mind waiting for 20 minutes in the building, if you're not going to anyway, to listen to what is going to take place later on today? Just in case there are any questions from outside. I think it's fairly unlikely, but I don't know, and one never knows. But thank you very much indeed for coming and giving evidence. I'm grateful to you. One of the things I am looking into is why the WRP was infiltrated by 2 officers, one of whom we have heard from. The other one is not able to give evidence, and we have to go on the documents that have been retrieved. But thank you very much indeed. Grateful to you.
Thank you.
Now, we'll now break for 10 minutes to enable the hearing room to be set up again for our next witness. Thank you. Mr. Boss, I understand you wish to take the oath, is that right?
Yes, sir, I
Yes,
do indeed.
then Mr. Fernandez will administer it to you.
Thank you. Please place your Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Barr.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Moss, could you give us your full name, please?
Barry Moss.
You've provided us with two witness statements, the second of which is dated the 26th of July 2021. Are the contents of that witness statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are, sir.
Can I start with a few questions about your training? I appreciate I may be taking you back a very long while. I'm interested in any training that you had during the period between 1968 and about 1983. During that period, did you get any training about a police officer's powers of entry, search, and seizure?
Only in terms of the initial training at the police training school when I was a recruit. I did do a CID course, but I can't remember if that was it within the period that you're talking about. So I think it probably was. So I did a CID course as well when that would have been covered.
And were you given any instruction at any stage about whether or not those powers of entry, search and seizure, and perhaps more importantly, the limitations on a police officer's powers of entry, search and seizure, were the same or different when you were operating in an undercover capacity?
No, the question of undercover working wasn't covered in any of those courses, sir.
Did you ever address your mind to whether or not those limitations on powers of entry, search and seizure still applied to an officer operating undercover?
No, I suppose I didn't.
Can I ask you whether you were ever given any training, I appreciate this is a long shot, on the European Convention of Human Rights during the Tranche 1 era?
No, none at all, sir.
And you've already confirmed in your witness statement that you didn't receive any training on either the Race Relations Act or the Sex Discrimination Act in that period.
Correct, sir.
Did you give any consideration at any time that you were working for the SDS during the Tranche 1 era to whether or not what you or the unit was doing was discriminatory either on racial grounds or on grounds of sex?
No, sir, because I don't believe it was discriminatory in either of those cases.
That's slightly two different questions. The first question is, did you ever address your mind to it at all?
No, sir.
Were you trained on Peelian principles? Sir Robert Peel's 9 Principles of Policing.
No, sir.
At any time at Hendon or Bramshill or on the CID course?
No, I remember we all learnt the primary objects of policing, which were allegedly put down by Sir Richard Mayne, but nothing other than that, sir.
Let me try you with a few. I'm just going to... the second Peelian principle is the ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent upon public approval of police actions. Was that your understanding at the time?
Well, I suppose in the more, modern era, sir, that would be called policing by consent. So
Indeed.
I was familiar with it in that guise, yes.
And were you familiar with it in that guise back in 1968?
Probably not, sir, no.
The police must secure the willing cooperation of the public in voluntary observation of the law to be able to secure and maintain the respect of the public.
Principles that I would agree with, sir, but I wasn't aware of them at that time.
If you weren't aware of them as specific principles, did you have any consciousness that you needed to police in a way which would maintain the respect of the public?
Again, perhaps not so much at that time.
The third one is Principle 7. Police at all times should maintain a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence.
Yes, I was aware of that, sir, not necessarily as a Pelion principle, because I hadn't heard of that, but certainly from courses at Bramshill, that issue would have been debated.
And did you accept it and understand it?
Yes, sir.
Can I move now to 1968, when you joined the SDS? Unfortunately, Conrad Dixon has passed away, so we can't ask him. Just in case, were you aware of whether or not Mr. Dixon or any other senior officer setting up the SDS took any legal advice when doing so?
I wasn't aware, sir.
Were you given by Detective Chief Inspector Dixon or anyone else any legal guidance or advice before you embarked upon work as an undercover officer?
No, sir.
You, I think, were quite new to Special Branch when you started as an undercover officer.
Yes, I'd been in Special Branch probably for a matter of months before I was chosen.
How did you know what to report?
The Met Police had had a bad time at the earlier Grosvenor Square demonstration, and the general instructions we were given then was to get as much information as we could about the organisations which had been involved in the earlier violence to assist in the policing of the later demonstration which was scheduled.
Now, you infiltrated mainly meetings of groups which had Maoist tendencies, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And your reporting was about the conduct of their meetings and what they were discussing.
Yes, sir.
Some of it pertained to the 27th of October demonstration that was forthcoming. Some of it didn't. What I would like to know is, was there any common understanding that you should be reporting on all of it as opposed to just that which went to the demonstration?
The common understanding, as I understood it, was that we should report on all of it.
And where did you get that understanding from?
I can't be specific, sir. It was the general ethos within the office. I don't think Mr. Dixon sat us down and told us that. It was a general understanding. I can't be more specific, I'm afraid.
Can we look at one specific document from that era? It's MPS-0733929. Now, this is a report dated the 25th of September 1968 about the October 27th Committee for Solidarity with Vietnam. And it says it was a meeting which lasted between 7:30 p.m. and 10:15 p.m. at, and then we've redacted the address for privacy reasons, home of privacy. So this appears to be a report of a meeting that took place in a private home. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And if we scroll down, please. And then over the page, please. We see the content of the meeting, and if we can go down further, we see the signature block is, we've redacted your signature, but it's your name. You signed that report, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And was that because it was you who attended that meeting?
Yes, sir.
Were you given any advice or guidance as to whether or not you should enter a private home to listen in on the content of an activists' meeting?
No specific guidance, sir, but the general ethos was that we should do what was necessary to get the best information possible pertaining to the forthcoming demonstration.
What was your understanding at the time of the legal position as to whether or not it was lawful for you as a police officer to enter someone's home?
We were given no specific guidance for our activities in this particular case. I think my understanding of the rules in normal work would have been fairly clear. I had no idea that this may have been illegal, as I've seen from Miss Kilroy's submission earlier to this inquiry.
Would it be fair to say no consideration was given to the question as to whether or not it was?
Yes, that's probably the best way of putting it.
Could I have a yes-no answer to the next question, please? When you were operating undercover, did you have a birth certificate?
No.
Can we move now from your short stint as an undercover officer in the SDS to your time in C Squad between then and your assuming the position of head of the SDS? You have told us in your witness statement why it is that we have 3 reports from 1971 which are signed by you at a time when you were not in the SDS. And the short explanation is you were working as a detective inspector in C Squad, and these were SDS intelligence reports which crossed your desk in the course of that work.
Yes, sir.
Now, first of all, if we could have up, please, MPS 0735902. So this is tab 1 of the bundle. Now, this is the minute sheet or cover sheet. Perhaps you can tell me what the correct nomenclature is.
Minute sheet. Sir.
Minute sheet for a report dated the 1st of November. And you have told us in your witness statement that this is your handwriting.
Yes, sir.
So as a C Squad detective inspector, you are recording where this report should go.
Yes, sir.
Did you receive the report in its written form from the SDS, or did you write this up from notes?
No, I would have received that report. That would have arrived in my in-tray, and I would have actioned it accordingly.
You've decided on, well, is it you who's making the decision as to where this information goes?
I was fairly junior in those days, sir, and what would have happened was that I wrote the minute, and next to the date you'll see the initials, which are my initials, and then the chief superintendent would have looked at what I'd done to make sure I was doing things right, and if he was satisfied with that, he would have signed it off.
So would it be fair to say you are making a decision and your decision is being checked by a superior
Correct,
officer?
sir, yes.
And on what basis do you make the decision?
From, I was relatively junior in those days, I already said, but from experience, from the contents of the report, and generally speaking, if this was an SDS report, it was probably even routinely sent to security service. I can't remember what room 892 was, but D.I. Wilson, I'm guessing, was the DI in charge of the section who had a particular interest in monitoring whatever that group was. It's an organisational file, as you can tell from the 400 prefix.
And PA means put away.
Put away in special branch records, so
Yep.
yes.
Could we go over the page, please? Now, I'm not too interested in the contents of this report. I'm interested right at the bottom, please, on the left. There is a manuscript note which reads S9090. And you've suggested in your witness statement that you think the S may stand for S Squad.
Yes, sir.
The inquiry's understanding is that S Squad of Special Branch didn't exist until 1974. Can you help us with whether we are wrong about that, or whether your recollection now may be wrong?
Well, I was just looking closer to see whether it actually said B, but my response will still be the same, that was the way that the quantity of work was measured, not necessarily the quality. And the prefix letter, in my recollection, just pertains to the squad from which it originated.
Well, if we move on from the letter to the number, if the number is an indication of quantity, is that an indication of the quantity of reports which is coming across your desk on C Squad, or is it an indication of some other quantity?
My recollection, and this is a bit hazy, and bear in mind there were no computers in those days, is that there was a central register maintained in Special Branch, and the first report submitted anywhere in Special Branch at the beginning of the year would have been number 1, and then the numbers would creep up over the year. And each squad would take a block of numbers and use those numbers for their reports until that block of numbers was used up. Then they'd go and get another block from this central register. So this would have been report 9090 in Special Branch. It wouldn't necessarily have been report 9090 from S Squad, or whichever squad it was.
And it follows from that answer, it's not a measure of how many reports the SDS had produced.
No, sir, no.
When you were working on C Squad and intelligence such as this was crossing your desk, did you have any responsibility for preparing threat assessments for A8?
No, I didn't, sir. That would have been done by someone else on C Squad, and not by me sitting in that chair at that time.
Did you ever have the job of preparing threat assessments for A8?
I probably did once or twice, sir, yes. I didn't actually spend much time on C Squad, so I was aware of them. I did a few of them, probably not that many.
Can you help us then in rough terms what the process involved of preparing a threat assessment for A8?
It would be done by the DI, usually in charge of the section that had the most knowledge of that particular organisation. He would, or she, would call on their knowledge of the organisations involved, their personal knowledge. They would draw files of the organisation involved, and that would include any SDS reporting. And they would combine their experience with what was on record and produce the threat assessment.
Now, were these threat assessments which was for specific forthcoming events at which it was thought there might be a public order issue, or were they more general?
No, they were for a particular demonstration.
I appreciate your practical experience of doing this was limited, and do say if you can't help us. But from the ones that you compiled, were you able to tell which was the SDS intelligence and which was intelligence from other sources?
Yes, in that the SDS reports, the preamble usually gave an indication that it came from SDS if you understood the system.
And are you able then to recall any specific forthcoming demonstration or other event where you filled out a threat assessment which was at least in part informed by SDS intelligence?
No, I can't, sir, not at this length of time.
Does it follow from that that you are not able to help us with quantifying the contribution that SDS intelligence made to any threat assessment that you were a party to?
It does, sir, yes.
Can we move now to another question, in case you can help, and if you can't, say so. Could we have up UCPI 503570? Can we scroll down until we can see something, please? Thank you. We think that this is the registry file record sheet of Diane Langford. We think there's a misspelling, who is one of our core participants. Is that what this is?
Yes, sir.
There are various dates in the left-hand column. They largely run chronologically, but not entirely so. I can take you to an example if you would like to see one, but otherwise, can you just help us in general terms how it might be that on a record sheet there might be entries out of chronological order?
Yes, the record system we had in those days was, for its time, a very sophisticated paper-only system, which obviously predates computers. And the purpose of the record sheet was to give cross-references to other places, other files, where a report concerning Diane Langford were to be found. These are all put in manually by a staff of several dozens of people, and the reports would come from the squads, and it would just depend which report reached which clerk at which time. So if you had reports coming from different sources, it might get to Clerk A, who might have the record sheet, and then someone else would ask for the file to add something they had on their desk, which might just be out of sequence. So the dates are the dates of the report, not the dates when they were input onto the record sheet.
Thank you. Could we have page 8 of this document, please? And could we scroll down? Yes, thank you. I'm interested in the, yes, from the 20th of May 1971, a pattern starts of letters appearing to the right of the date sometimes. Some of them say SP, some of them say C. Can you help us as to what those acronyms or what those letters mean?
Yes, that refers to the classification of the file. We used to use three. The government has a system of paper classification, which we used to follow, but for reasons which I can't really enlighten you about in any great detail, we had two classifications of secret file. So the C stands for confidential. I don't think, ever dealt with anything at the lower classification, which was restricted. So that didn't exist in Special Branch. But we had two classifications of secret file. One was secret pink, and the other was secret green, SG. The secret pink files were fairly easily available to anyone in Special Branch, and the secret greens were slightly more highly classified, and they would not be given out freely to staff members, even vetted staff members, usually because there was something, perhaps one or two items a bit more sensitive on them. So SP means secret pink, C means confidential.
Thank you very much. Can we take that down now, please? Did you ever sit on the industrial desk?
No, sir.
When you were working in C Squad, or indeed anywhere else in Special Branch, did you ever pass requests for intelligence down to the SDS?
I don't think so, sir, but as I didn't really spend that much time on C Squad. Because I'd been on a particular course, I was being rotated around the squads to sort of broaden my experience, and so my time on C Squad was quite limited. And subsequently, I didn't go back to C Squad.
Do you know whether your colleagues did that?
I would imagine they did, sir, yes.
When you say imagine, do you know or not?
No, sir, I don't know.
Thank you. Can we now move into the 1980s? I'd like to start by anchoring the dates of your service as a manager within the SDS. The earliest document that we've been able to find is a document dated the 11th of February 1980, bearing your signature in the capacity as the head of the SDS. Do you think that's about when you started?
I think I probably started the month before that, sir.
You were promoted on the 5th of January 1981. Can you recall whether that was the date you left the SDS?
Yes, that came about because the previous post holder retired, and I stayed on S Squad, so I still had overall responsibility for the SDS, but it was among other things.
When you started, was Detective Inspector Butler acting up?
No, sir. When I took over, Chief Inspector Ferguson was still on the scene. Mr. Butler was there, but Mr. Ferguson was the Chief Inspector until the day I took over.
Did you get a handover?
No, I didn't, sir. Not from Mr. Ferguson, but Mr. Butler was extremely helpful.
Don't go into details when answering this question, but did Mr. Butler tell you about all of the UCOs who were operating within the SDS?
Yes,
Did
sir.
Mr. Butler cover what was going to be expected of you as a head of the SDS?
I wouldn't say he covered it in words of one syllable. I had an idea myself, and I picked it up in fairly quick time, I would say.
And where did you get the idea from?
Because I've been a UCO 12 years previously, albeit the operation was a very different one to the one I left.
Were you told, either at the outset of your service as head of the SDS or at any other time, that there had been in the past a problem with an undercover officer having been confronted with the death certificate of the child whose identity he had used?
I was aware of it, sir, but I'm not sure where I got to know about it.
Can you help us with when you got to know about it?
It may have been when I rejoined the SDS. I can't be more specific, but I was aware of it.
And aware of it whilst you were the head of the SDS?
Yes, sir.
We may come back to that in a little while. Were you told about any past or present instance of an undercover police officer having been involved in sexual activity with anybody in his undercover identity?
No, sir.
Were you told in general terms that this was something that either was or might be happening?
No, sir.
Specifically, and you may want to use the chart you've got, whether HN 300 had married an activist.
So I haven't got the chart, sir.
We should have a key for you to make sure you know who we're talking about without using the name. Well, perhaps while that's being found, I will move on. Did you hear any statement or rumour about an undercover officer having his cover blown as a result of being involved with women whilst undercover?
No, sir.
Did you get any instruction or guidance, or was there any discussion at all about the legality or ethics of what the SDS was doing whilst you were the head of the unit?
No, sir.
Were you given a briefing about what was being gathered by the SDS when you started as its head?
I wasn't given a briefing, sir, but I think I would say I was probably fairly well aware from my previous experience, albeit a long time previously, and I was aware what the SDS was for.
Well, there had been quite a change, hadn't there, between
Yes,
the early days and the focus on the Vietnam Solidarity Committee and other groups that were involved in organising the 27th of October demonstration on the one hand, and by the time we get to 1980, when there is deployment across a much wider field for much longer terms, when did you become aware that the SDS was operating in that different way?
Well, I suppose within a couple of weeks, sir, from my talks with Mr. Butler and from seeing the product.
When you did establish which groups were being infiltrated by the undercover officers under your command, were there any surprises?
Yes, I was surprised at the level of coverage of the SWP.
And we'll come back to that a little later. Were you given any introduction before you actually met them face to face about the relationship between the SDS and the security service?
No, sir, but I would say I was aware of it, because although I didn't spend much time on C Squad, I'd been in Special Branch in various other roles, so I was aware of the links of Special Branch in general with the security service.
Were you told anything about the unit's relationship with A8?
Well, the unit itself didn't have a direct relationship with A8. The relationship with A8 was with C Squad.
I'd understood that there were occasions when either the detective chief inspector or the detective inspector might telephone A8 direct with urgent intelligence.
Sorry, I understand what you mean. Yes, that would happen occasionally, but it was only if it was something urgent. I understand the question.
Was there a direct relationship with B and C squads?
With C Squad, definitely. With B Squad, less so.
And what was your relationship with C Squad whilst you were DCI of the SDS?
It's difficult to put it in formal words. Special Branch was even then a relatively small organisation, and relationships were on quite an informal basis. I'm not quite sure where you're going with
Well, let me
this
try
one,
this.
sir.
If I've understood correctly, when you first take up the post, you are based in Scotland Yard.
Yes, sir.
And you are either on a corridor or not very far away from the superintendent who is next above you in the chain of command.
Yes, sir.
And are you not very far away from C Squad either?
Correct, sir.
I am wanting to understand whether the relationship that you have with C Squad is one where you are frequently talking to officers within C Squad because you're in the same building, very close to one another in physical proximity, and you are providing intelligence to C Squad. Is there a regular dialogue?
An ad hoc dialogue, sir, probably not a regular.
And when you say ad hoc, could you help us a little paint the picture of what day-to-day life was like?
The days might pass when I'd have nothing to do with C Squad whatsoever. But if there was something particular coming up that they wanted perhaps particular help on, then they might ask me to go along to their office or pop down to see us. That's what I mean. That's what I mean by ad hoc.
And how frequently did that sort of request get made?
Again, if there was a need, if there was a big demonstration expected, then they might come to us asking if we could help in a particular area. But it wasn't a regular thing. It's more a sort of routine and often done via paperwork, I would say.
And how often were you getting paper requests from C Squad with specific intelligence requests?
I couldn't really answer that, sir.
Could you help us with whether we're talking daily, weekly, monthly, less frequently than that?
I see. Maybe between weekly and monthly. It was more, if I can help, it was more us knowing more or less what C Squad wanted from sort of long understanding of how Special Branch worked, even though I personally hadn't spent that much time in C Squad, and providing what we believed they needed. And if we were giving them things they didn't want, or if we weren't giving them things they did want, that is when the interaction would take place.
And is this an understanding which starts with the course when an officer joins Special Branch and then is developed through experience?
Yes, that is probably a fair comment.
When you started with the SDS, were you told that officers were using deceased children's identities as part of their undercover identities?
Yes, sir.
And that was obviously a change from the position in 1968.
It certainly was, sir.
We'll come back to that in a little more detail later. Were you told anything about how the targets which your officers were infiltrating had been selected?
I wasn't specifically told this on the day I started, but I gained an understanding of it in fairly quick time. And it was based on the, perhaps not the present needs, the future needs of the branch as they were perceived in terms of the organisations which were likely to be more involved or most involved in public disorder.
Did you know who had made the decisions as to where to place the officers who were already deployed when you took up the reins?
No, I didn't know where those decisions were made. I know how we dealt with it subsequently.
When we come to HN19, we'll come to that in due course. Were you asked or told to review the deployments that were extant when you joined the SDS?
No, I would have liked to review them because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I thought that we had perhaps too much coverage of the SWP.
Was there any expectation that you would conduct any form of review of deployments?
No, it would have been something that was up to me to do, but the trouble with an organisation like the SDS is you cannot just easily move people around once they're well entrenched. And so it is almost a question of waiting for someone to go and then not backfilling that vacancy, if I can put it like that.
Can I infer from your answer that you were not directing your mind to whether or not a existing deployment was serving any purpose, any useful purpose, and should therefore be terminated?
I did always have that in mind, but the problem is that if you decide a deployment is not serving any useful purpose, and I don't think any of them, I would say, serve no useful purpose, the only way of terminating it is to move an experienced officer out and not replace him. And then you've got to bring in someone inexperienced and put him somewhere else, him or her.
Now, without going into specifics at this stage, were there any of the deployments on your watch that you thought were serving no useful policing purpose?
No, I don't think there were, sir.
I'm driving at whether there were any that you thought were of use only to the security service.
I see. I suppose my comments about the SWP were that maybe we could have got the same level of intelligence with perhaps fewer officers in the SWP, but for reasons I've explained, I didn't feel that we could usefully withdraw people at that stage. And yes, certainly the security service were interested in all our SWP reporting.
We'll certainly come to that in due course in more detail, but at this stage what I'm asking is, were there any deployments that you regarded were being conducted purely for the benefit of the security service?
No, so what we gave them was, if you like, a byproduct of our need for intelligence about public disorder.
Can we look, please, at a document now? It's MPS-0728-963. That's tab 10, sir. Now, what's come up first is a covering letter to the SDS 1979 report. Could we go to page 9, please? Now, I appreciate, Mr. Moss, that this was the report for the year before you were responsible for the SDS, but it was dated, the covering letter is dated April. It's signed off by Detective Inspector Butler, but presumably you would have seen this document before it was sent up the chain of command.
Yes, sir, I think I would. I've certainly seen it, I can't quite remember when.
If we could scroll down to the bottom so we can read paragraph 7. Paragraph 7 starts with the sentence, "At a time when covert police activity is being subjected to increasingly close and critical scrutiny, it remains of vital importance that all possible precautions should be taken to safeguard the identities of field officers and the anonymity of HQ flats." Can you help us with what the increasingly close and critical scrutiny was?
I can't, sir, no.
Can you help us with whether it was generally the perception that operational security was of paramount importance?
Yes, I would say it was. To the best of my knowledge, there was no other organisation in the country or even in the world that was doing what we were doing. And we believed that our methods and the identities of the individuals needed safeguarding.
Were you aware of concerns being expressed in the Home Office around the time that you were the head of the SDS about the role of Special Branch generally in support of the security service?
No, I wasn't, sir. Not at the time.
Can I come back to cover identities, please? Were you aware of any previous compromises of undercover police officers in the SDS?
Only the one that we've already mentioned, sir.
The one that involved the death certificate.
Yes.
Did you give any thought to the fact that there was a risk that your officers might also have their deceased child's death certificates discovered?
Yes, of course. So once I was aware of the earlier one that we've already spoken about. That's always a risk. But it's a risk that we had to take because in those days there was no other way of getting the supporting documents which we needed without a birth certificate. Oh, which mean a passport and so on.
Were any of your officers on your watch asked to produce a birth certificate
By the...
by the groups they were infiltrating?
Not that I'm aware of, sir, no.
When your officers built their legends, do you know whether they did it entirely on their own or with assistance from other members of the unit?
I think that probably depends. I don't know the answer to that, sir, but I'm guessing it depended on the attitude and the need for support of the officer undertaking the research.
And on your watch, it wasn't a frequent occurrence, was it?
It wasn't, no.
Did you delegate supervision of the creation of the identities because you've told us that you didn't do it yourself?
You mean I didn't do it for me personally, sir? Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, your witness statement, as I understand it, says that you didn't take a personal hand in overseeing the creation of a cover identity by any of your subordinates.
That's correct.
I'm asking whether you delegated that job or whether you just left the officers to it.
Left the officers to it, sir.
Did you check or test how robust the cover legends were?
I didn't personally know, sir.
Did you consider the ethics of using a deceased child's identity?
Yes, I did, sir. Particularly with hindsight, I suppose. But as I've just said, I didn't see any other way of being able to get the supporting documents than having a birth certificate. And with hindsight, perhaps we could have done it. Well, I don't think we could have done it another way.
There is another question, though. Was it actually necessary for your officers to have the additional protection that comes from having a birth certificate? And I don't want you to go into details, but anything else that flowed from that?
I think we did need it because unlike many other undercover deployments, ours were for a period of several years, whereas many other undercover deployments elsewhere in the police service were just for a matter of weeks, and identities were unlikely to be so severely challenged.
Were any of the officers on your watch the subject of close scrutiny?
Not that I'm aware of, sir, no.
Can I take it from earlier answers you've given me about the legal position that you didn't address your mind to whether or not the use of deceased children's identities was lawful or not?
I didn't, sir, no.
Having been aware of the compromise where the officer was confronted with his death certificate, did you accept that there might be a risk that a family might find out if another officer was so compromised?
Yes, I did, sir, but I suppose on the balance of probabilities, I don't know when the practice of using dead children's identities started, but clearly it had been going on for 5-6 years before I came back, and that had been the only incident, so I thought that the chances of it happening again were probably remote.
Was there a black folder with advice and guidance for undercover police officers?
So I've thought about this since reading submissions, and I don't recall seeing one. I've no doubt it was, but I don't recall seeing it.
Was there any other form of written material to help the officers?
Not that I remember seeing.
Now, you've said in your witness statement that you didn't provide your officers with any guidance. Why not?
Guidance in what way, sir?
In terms of any training?
Because the system that I inherited, which I thought was a good system, was that while in the back office, they assisted in processing the reports, they had time to create their identity and legend, and more importantly, they came out to the meetings at the Safe House often twice a week, and they had every opportunity to speak to existing officers.
Well, my next question is, how would officers know what they could and couldn't do in the absence of any formal guidance?
They had informal guidance, sir, and it is difficult to give precise guidance in the sort of undercover field that we were operating on. It almost requires them to come back and say, I find myself in this situation, how should I deal with that? Rather than us saying, you can do this, you can't do that.
So would it be fair to characterise the way this was dealt with as entirely reactive?
Reactive and based on experience that had gone before. So some guidance, but it was informal guidance.
Produced in response to issues being raised by officers?
And things that had happened.
Are you saying that you would have prospectively said, look, this has happened, be aware, don't do that,
Exactly.
do this?
Yes, sir.
Can you think of any specific examples without naming the names of any officers?
Well, I think everyone was aware of the incident that we've already spoken about, where the birth and death certificate was produced. It didn't happen on my watch, as far as I'm aware, but people were aware of arrests that had happened, and so what to do if arrested. Those are the main sort of fields that I can think of.
Coming back to targeting and HN19, HN19 was targeted towards the Revolutionary Communist Party in the Revolutionary Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninist. Did you communicate that decision to him?
So I still haven't got the key, so I still don't know who HN19 is or was.
I think I know the name, but I'm not going to chance it.
I mean, answering your question without knowing who we're talking about, sir.
No, don't do that. That's
All
not
right,
fair.
then.
When we've got the key, we'll come back to that.
I think can't it be dealt with in this way? This is the officer who was deployed for the first time during your watch.
Right, sir. Thank you. I can't remember whether it was me or whether it was Trevor Butler who told him where he was going, sir.
But you do know of whom I'm speaking.
I do now, sir, yes.
Who actually made the decision as to where HN19 was going to be deployed?
Again, I can't exactly remember, sir. It was probably jointly, maybe between C Squad, myself, Trevor Butler. I really can't remember. I mean, I'd already said that I felt that we had over coverage of SWP, so I certainly wouldn't have wanted him to go there.
I'm getting the impression that there was essentially a consultation and discussion between C Squad and within the SDS management. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. So we would not have single-handedly decided where to put people.
And if there'd been, was there any disagreement?
About this particular?
Yes.
Not that I'm aware of, sir, no.
If there had been any disagreement, who would have had the final say?
Probably C Squad, sir.
Is that because they would have outranked you?
No, if you like, they were our term I don't like. They were our customers. We were there to serve them, not the other way around.
And by C Squad, were you talking to the chief superintendent, the superintendent, or somebody else?
It would have been someone in that area of ranking. So I mean, it would have been probably an informal chat one afternoon. You know, we've got a new officer. Where would be an area that you particularly would like him to go, if we can agree that?
Was there any consideration of deploying into the far right?
Yes, there was. Not with regard to this particular individual. It is something that probably just Trevor Butler and I discussed. May have gone higher up the rank structure. And I think there was probably a policy decision at that time not to deploy one into the far right because they were too violent. And we were concerned what the officer may have to do to prove his credentials.
Did you consider it any part of your role when discussing where HN19 should be deployed to consider whether or not there were alternative ways of getting the same product for your customer?
No, I suppose I didn't as specifically as that. I mean, it's always a consideration. Can you get this information from some other source? But you never quite know what you're going to get from the other source until you try it, by which time it might be too late.
Can I take it from your earlier answers about the law that you were taking into consideration your customers' needs and the safety of your officers, but you were, and the public, but you were not taking into account any legal considerations, and you are not making any assessment of the proportionality of the intrusion into privacy weighed against the value of the product for policing purposes?
I suppose not at that time, sir, no.
Do you think it would have been a good idea to have had a formal review of deployments periodically?
With hindsight, yes, I do. The problem, as I said, sir, is that with the deep entrenchment of the SDS officers, it was not that easy, possibly even impossible, to move them from one field to another. So the only option would be to actually remove someone altogether, which may have been an option, of course.
And can I take it that if you had been provided with formal training about the legal parameters in which you should work, or any legal advice, you would have followed those procedures and any such advice?
Oh, absolutely, sir.
From these rather legalistic questions, can we move to something a little bit more political? You were in post just after the 1979 general election, which brought about a significant political change in the country. Did you change in any way the intelligence that was being gathered as a result of the outcome of the 1979 general election?
No, sir, we didn't. I mean, the early 80s were a sort of febrile time for all the reasons that you've outlined. I mean, inflation was high, unemployment was high, industrial unrest was high. There were certainly a very large number of demonstrations in 1980, a dozen or so that required 1,000 police officers, many more that required over 100 police officers. Even that's a pretty large chunk of policing. So I would say that we were reporting in 1980 on probably 5 or 6 public order events, plus of course there was quite a lot of picketing going on as a result probably of the new government coming in, all of which required police coverage, and we may well have reported on that as well in a public disorder sense. So
Volume went up.
volume went up dramatically, and it carried on the following year as well, sir. In fact, went up the following year.
Was there any change in the nature of requests for information as to targets coming from either C Squad or the security service as a result of the change of government?
No, I don't recall anything specific as a result of the change of government, certainly not from C Squad. I mean, as you're aware, we had fairly regular meetings with the security service. In fact, the minutes I've been shown are more regular than I realised. They would often try and influence our deployments, and I suppose we would accede to their requests if they didn't cut across our primary responsibility, which was public disorder, and always was. Everything on the subversive side was a byproduct of the public order work that we were doing.
We'll be coming to those documents in just a moment. Before we do so, there's one further question. In the 1981 election, Ken Livingstone became the leader of the Greater London Council. I think he had the tabloid persona Red Ken. Was there any change in intelligence request, and in particular, did anybody ask you to report on him?
No, sir.
So we've had one break this morning already, but might it be a good idea to have another short break?
Yes, I think everybody may need to stretch their legs. Can we say 10 minutes? You content with
Fine,
that?
sir. Yes.
Fine. Then
Whatever suits you.
We'll break for 10 minutes. We'll start again at 1:15.
All rise, please.
So, thank you. We're going to move now to the minutes that we've recovered from the security service describing meetings that they had with you, amongst others, whilst you were the head of the SDS. Can we go to the first one, please? It's in tab 8 of the bundle, sir. It's at UCPI 5028813. This is dated the 24th of March 1980, so not very long after you had started. Going to take you through this step at a time. We start with paragraph 1. F6, that's from the security service, and I met the new head of SDS, Barry Moss, and Trevor Butler for drinks in CSH. Is CSH their premises?
It was Curzon Street House, sir.
On the 17th of March 1980. We thank them for the flow of valuable reports that they provided, and in particular the recent detailed report on the IMG World Congress. D.I. Butler promised that a further long report on the IMG was in the course of preparation. Was it your general understanding that the security service were very grateful for the information that you were providing to them?
Yes, sir.
Did you get the impression that that was politeness, or whether they were they found it genuinely valuable?
I think they found it genuinely valuable, sir.
And without going into any specific details, can you help us as to what lies beneath that view?
In my, excuse me, my very early days in Special Branch, going back to '68, I was on C Squad then, and our work was predicated by request after request after request from the security service for information about the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, and that was really our bread and butter. That hadn't really changed, and so when I became head of the SDS, their CPGB by then was more or less defunct, but of course had been replaced in their minds by the SWP. And I think that we were probably their main source in the SWP, and I think they were genuinely grateful for it.
I mean, this particular thanks relates to the IMG.
To the IMG, so
but,
yes.
But was it so it's your general experience they were particularly
Of
grateful?
the left-wing groups, left-wing, as they saw them, subversive groups.
Are these groups that I think are sometimes described as the ultra-left?
Yes, sir.
The ones that are sometimes described as further left than the CPGB?
Yes.
Paragraph 2 it appears to be you offering a debrief of one of your officers by the security service. In other words, offering them access to your officer to speak about his deployment. Without naming names, have I understood correctly?
Yes, sir.
And that appears to have been well received.
Yes, sir.
Do you know, again without naming names, whether that was something that had happened before?
I believe it had, sir. Not in every case, but from time to time.
And where had you got that belief from?
I would imagine that Trevor Butler, he was, how can I put it, my mentor to an extent, because I didn't have much of a handover from Mike Ferguson. I would imagine that Trevor told me that.
Thank you. If we can now go to paragraph 3, if I've understood that correctly, the gist is that you are seeking feedback from them about the reporting that you were providing to them.
Yes, sir. As I think I've touched on when we were talking about the numbers of reports at the beginning of my evidence, it's very easy in the intelligence world to judge the quantity of material. It's quite difficult to judge the quality of the material. I imagine that's a problem even the security service have with their own product. So to get feedback from someone who received a lot of work from us would be valuable to us.
And without going into specifics, did you get feedback?
I can't remember, sir. I would imagine so, yes.
And if there had been feedback to the effect of we want this, more of this, less of that, would that have been fed into your conversations with your officers?
Yes, but as I've said before, our primary objective was demonstrations, public order, and anything we did for the security service was ancillary to that.
Yes, I think you've made that
Yes.
clear earlier. But on that point, if we move to paragraph 4, you are described as very much more forthcoming than your predecessor, who we know was Michael Ferguson. And they go on to say, and I think we can look forward to mutually useful cooperation. So was it your view that, subject to the fact that your primary mission was public order policing, that you should be as helpful as possible in servicing the security services requests?
With that caveat, sir, yes.
Can we go to tab 11? That is UCPI 5028814. Now this is dated the 8th of April 1980, and at paragraph 2 the document says the purpose of the meeting was to introduce me as F6's successor, as the F6 point of contact with the SDS. Now this meeting occurs 2 weeks after the last one or thereabouts. Was that more frequent than normal, or normal
very
frequency?
much so, sir, very much.
And is that explained by the fact that it was to introduce the new point of contact?
I imagine so, sir, yes.
Now, at the bottom of the page, the bottom of paragraph 5, thank you, the last couple of sentences, well, the last sentence, 2 sentences read, this discussion also highlighted the advantages they have over ourselves when Butler told me that they meet their sources 2 to 3 times a week. Their sources are fully briefed and all options are discussed at these meetings. The picture I'm getting from that is they are rather envious of the fact that you are using undercover police officers who you are meeting 2 or 3 times a week and can have a constant dialogue with about how they go about their business. Is that, have I understood it correctly?
Absolutely correctly, sir. One of the reasons for the creation of the SDS was that informants are notoriously difficult to handle, and that is backed up by the comments at the end of that report.
Can we take that down, please, and now go to tab 16 in the bundle, UCPI 5028816. And we've gone through to July 1980. And this is a meeting at which you and D.I. Butler go to F6 office. It's described as a routine meeting. That's happening some 4 months after the last such meeting that we have a record of. Is that your recollection of about the usual frequency?
Yes, sir.
And then at paragraph 2A, if I've understood that correctly, the gist is they have got an out-of-date list of where your officers are deployed, and you are going to provide them with an up-to-date list.
Yes, sir.
Does it follow from that we can assume that in this period at least, the security service was fully sighted on at least the fields that your officers were working in?
Yes, sir.
And would they know the real and cover names of the officers as well? No examples, of course.
No, it would have only been the cover names. I'm a little bit surprised seeing this. My memory told me that we didn't actually tell them the cover names. We told them the groups, but not the cover names. But that looks as though we actually did give them the cover names. We certainly wouldn't give them the real names.
Little b, at the security services request, I asked if the information contained in the paragraphs on the troops out movement could be passed to, and then there's reference to liaison partners. Were requests to disseminate intelligence that had emanated from the SDS beyond the security service something that happened on more than this one occasion or not?
No, sir, I'm not aware of it ever happening other than on that occasion.
And I think you explain in your witness statement that when you made the statement, you couldn't recall what the outcome of that request
No,
was.
sir. No.
Without naming liaison partners, is your recollection any better now?
The recollection isn't any better, because obviously I have seen the unredacted one of this. The recollection is no better, but there had been problems in that area before. I'm guessing that the outcome may have been no.
We then move over the page, please, to, if I've interpreted properly, a direct and specific request from the Security Service for more information on the Revolutionary Labour League, and then a discussion about that group. Were specific requests like this common?
Yes, and perhaps not common, but fairly regular.
If we move down to the next subparagraph about the London Workers' Group, you asked them if they were interested in the group. They said yes, and then you say that you will provide more information about that group to them. I'm getting the impression of a real dialogue between professionals. Is that a fair depiction of what is going on?
Yes, sir. We each had our jobs to do. We knew what their job was, and we're all on the same side, as it were. So I would say yes, we would cooperate with them as much as possible, subject to our own needs.
So you weren't just passively responding to their requests. If you thought there was something they'd be interested in, you drew it to their attention.
Yes, sir.
E is about the debriefing of the officer whose real name we know is Vince Harvey. Do you know whether or not Mr. Harvey actually met with the security service?
No, sir, I don't.
Could we go to F? And there is a request, you're talking about membership details from the London area. Intelligence of very much the sort I was dealing with yesterday when calling a senior member of the Socialist Workers' Party. To what extent was the security service the driver behind collecting the membership details and similar intelligence from the SWP's headquarters?
I would say that they were the driver to collecting that sort of intelligence.
If we look at the very bottom of the page, it says DCI Moss said that their source achieved these results at some risk to himself and would be much happier if the source did not have to take this risk. Now, I think we do have the cipher list in the building now if you need it. But my question is, are we dealing with the officer HN155, cover name Phil Cooper, who infiltrated the SWP's headquarters?
It would have been him or one other officer.
And is that the
So-
officer HN80, cover name Colin Clark?
Yes, one of those two, so exactly.
I'm getting the impression from this passage that the SDS was taking risks that it wouldn't otherwise have taken in order to service a request from the security service. Is that a fair assessment?
This is, I suppose, one of the issues. So when giving directions, which we discussed earlier, it is very difficult. You've got to leave it to the judgment of the individuals on the ground as to whether that risk is a risk worth taking. And if they say it isn't, then you have to respect that judgment and not push them further.
Would it be fair to say that the position here seems to have been, the answer was reluctantly, yes, I'll do it,
Absolutely.
but making you know
Yes.
that the risk was increased by doing so?
So we would have probably said, look, use your own judgment. If you can't do it, don't. Because it's more important to keep you there than to have you exposed for their sake.
On your watch, did you sense a pressure from the security service to push your officers further up the SWP chain, if I describe it that way, than you might otherwise have done?
No, I didn't feel, there was no pressure to do that. So I think they were grateful for what was achieved when they were further up the chain, but in fairness to them, I don't remember any pressure from them to do it.
Well, looking at the utility of the information, list membership lists and things like that, they would be kept on special branch files as well as
Yes, sir.
security service files.
Everything we sent to them was duplicated on our files. We kept, as you would do in a normal business, we kept copies of what we sent to them.
Special branch is using them as part of those records as its intelligence database on ultra-left groups.
Special branches?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
It's using it, we'll come back perhaps later to this, for vetting purposes?
I think I sense there's lack of clarity about the use of that word, so
I'll tell you what, we'll come back to that whole topic
Okay,
later
sir.
in that case. But in terms of public order, the primary purpose you've told us of the SDS, membership lists aren't of any immediate use or any use, are they, in policing public disorder?
well, they're useful in that we need to know, to police public order, the number of members of any given organisations. And to take it a stage further, there's no point in just knowing numbers. You need to know the attitudes of those members. If you've got 2,000 members who are all totally peaceful and you know, visit the Quaker Meeting House on Sundays, then that is useful to know because it's negative reporting. But if you've got 2,000 members of whom 500 are pretty violent, that is also useful to know, and you need to know who they are.
But from a public order point of view, don't you need to know that sort of intelligence about numbers, demeanour, intentions in relation to a specific event?
Yes, you do, sir, but if the event is being organised by a so-and-so branch of the SWP, for argument's sake, then your starting base is how many people does that branch have, who are they, what are they like, what sort of demonstration are they likely to organise. Then the next step would be which other branches can they bring on board with them. Then the next step would be which other ultra-left groups might they bring out to support them. So that's why you need to know who the people are.
I'm getting the picture that the special branch officer sitting at his desk in C Squad producing a threat assessment might be looking at this sort of material.
Exactly that.
Is that
sir,
fair?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
If we could move on to the next page of the report, please. think in relation to the leveller, it seems to be the discussion was effectively no need for you to infiltrate the leveller. And then in relation to Freedom Collective, you are putting somebody into Freedom Collective and discussing that with the security service.
Yes, sir.
Now, was the deployment into the Freedom Collective a deployment that was being made because it was considered to be a threat to public order, or as a stepping stone to some further ultimate target?
I don't know the answer to that, sir. I'm guessing a stepping stone.
You then go to the bar for beer and sandwiches. And could you just give us a flavour of whether you were talking about work or other things over beer and sandwiches?
I'm probably still talking about work, sir.
And so it's through that informal chain as well that the relationship is cemented.
Yes.
And do you swap anecdotes and that sort of thing?
Yes, I suppose so. Like any sort of after-work meeting, there's a bit of work, a bit of just exchange of, I suppose, personal information.
Now, you've told us in your witness statement that in addition to these meetings that we've seen the records of, there was also some telephone contact between you and the security service. Is that right? Is that over an open line or over a secure line?
I think it was probably over a secure line. I can't imagine us talking to them over an open line.
So that's more substantive conversation about things like their requirements and so forth.
Yes, it wouldn't be a formal request for us to sort of change direction or something like that. It would more likely be passing us a little bit of updating information or a last-minute request for something, or vice versa.
Indirect contact between the SDS and the security service. You say in your statement that C Squad had daily contact with the security service. And I wanted to know how you knew that, how it worked, and what its relevance was to the SDS, if I can roll three questions into one.
Right. I should probably have put in my opinion to that statement, and it was based on my relatively short time in a management role on C Squad and my earlier time in a very junior role on C Squad. C Squad had, the management had secure phones on their desks. The more junior ranks weren't allowed to talk to the security service. Given the necessary interface, leaving aside the demonstration side of things, the necessary interface between C Squad and the security service, my assumption was that the contact would be pretty regular. So it was more an opinion. So does that answer your question?
Well, I think where it leads me is, to what extent did you receive requests via C Squad for intelligence that had in fact emanated from the security service?
I would say that probably most direct requests and interchange came at these meetings, and probably any more routine requests would come via C Squad, sir.
Is that supposition or known fact?
Known fact from time to time, supposition on other times.
I'd like to step back from the detail and ask you a couple of impressionistic questions about your relationship with the security service. How influential were they in targeting?
Influential to us, to the
Yes.
SDS?
How much influence did they have over the way you went about your business?
I suppose I would think they would like to have had more influence than they actually did have. It was, I wouldn't say it was, it wasn't quite a two-way flow of information. We probably gave them more than they gave us. They would like to have influenced us, and if we could accede to their requests without detriment to ourselves, then we would oblige them.
Who was actually taking the decisions as to which groups would be targeted and what information from within those groups would be focused on?
You mean right from the beginning?
On your watch?
Sorry. You mean I meant on the beginning of a deployment? Is that your
Well,
question?
let's start with the beginning.
Yeah. Well, there was only one who was deployed during my time, because when I went, there was someone in the back office, and I can't quite remember who it was, and his deployment was already decided. My thoughts are that we would have spoken to certainly C Squad. I doubt we wouldn't have spoken to the security service and sought their opinion on that. We'd have spoken to C Squad and asked what their needs were. We'd have used our own judgment based on public disorder. And there might have been an input from maybe Commander Operations, but I'm not sure about that.
And then you've told us, in terms of once the deployment is ongoing, you were doing your best to be accommodating, but was the formal decision-making as to whether or not you acceded to those requests your decision, or did you have to do what you were told?
No, I would say it was our decision at the office level, my decision, if you like.
Can we now take that document down and move to the definition of subversion? You have said in your witness statement that you understood subversion to be undermining the power or authority of an established system or institution. Where did you get your understanding of subversion from?
I suppose what I said then was perhaps a bit loose, and my understanding of subversion, which I probably should have learnt parrot fashion, was probably from either my early days on C Squad, although that predates, I think, the definitions that came out, or from an introductory course I did with the security service in 1970s sometime, when we were given the Denning definition and the other definition, which escapes me.
Well, we're going to show them now, and we appreciate in your witness statement you were relying on rather elderly memories. So let's have a look at the documents. Could we have UCPI 604459? Now, this is a document dated the 15th of June 1970, which encloses the April 1970 terms of reference for Special Branch. Are you now familiar with this document?
Yes, I think I've seen that one, sir.
Did you see it in the 1970s?
Probably not, sir, because if it was from ACPO, which it obviously is, it would have probably sort of stopped at the very senior level in SB, at least at that stage. So I probably wouldn't have seen this letter then.
If we can go, please, to page 2, and in particular paragraph 3, subsection D. Thank you. It says, in consultation with the security service to collect, process and record information about subversive or potentially subversive organisations and individuals. Was it your understanding that the role of Special Branch extended to assisting the security service not just in relation to groups which met the definition of subversion, i.e. were subversive, but also extended to groups which were potentially subversive?
In my very junior days, which I've touched on before, I believe all the requests that we had from the security service pertained to the CPGB, because that was the dominant feature then. Moving later and more up to the period we're dealing with now, I don't recall any requests for organisations that would be regarded as potentially subversive. I suppose depending on how you view the SWP, of course, and similar organisations.
And depending on how you define subversion.
Well, back to that argument, sir.
Page 4, please. Paragraph 3. It is important that special branches should have a clear idea of what constitutes, quote, persons and organisations which may be judged to be subversive of the security of the state. Broadly speaking, these are any organisation or individual whose purpose is the undermining or overthrow of the established democratic order. Now, the quote comes from the Maxwell-Fyfe definition of subversion. Do you recognise that as the definition of subversion that you were familiar with in the early 1970s?
The 1970s definition was a bit longer than that, but the tone was the same.
And then the second sentence that I read out, this vernacular interpretation, broadly speaking, this is any organisation or individual whose purpose is the undermining or overthrow of the established democratic order. Was that your understanding of what a subversive organisation or individual was?
That's a bit more like it, sir, yes.
Now, a feature of that definition is it is focused on purpose. So anybody who wants to overthrow the established democratic order falls within it. Does that accord with how you operated in the 1970s?
I suppose I'm thinking of the newer definition, which includes undermining the safety or well-being.
We'll come to that in a
later,
moment.
okay.
But sticking with the 1970 terms of reference, based on the Maxwell-Fyfe definition, which dates from the 1950s, you said a moment ago that you thought that's more like it. Is that on the ground how you and your officers understood subversion?
Yes, broadly speaking, sir, yes.
Now, what we call the Harris definition, which we understand was arrived at within the security service in 1972 and was communicated publicly in Parliament by Lord Harris in 1974, reads, subversive activities are, quote, those which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. My first question to you is, can you recall whether in 1972, when the security service adopted this definition, that was communicated to you?
I recall seeing a printed document, and I do mean printed as opposed to typewritten, setting out the terms of reference of special branch. And I've got a feeling that definition was in that, but I have not seen a copy of it since.
Can you recall what sort of date that would have been? If you can't recall accurately.
No, I can't really. So it's sort
I
of
won't
round
press
about
you.
the period you're talking of.
Well, let's look at a document which may help you. Can we have UCPI 604545, please? Now, this is a document from May 1974. It's a letter to all chief constables which adds to the 1970 terms of reference about, as one can see in block capitals, subversive activities in industrial disputes. Do you recall seeing this document?
Again, probably not that particular document. I'm guessing that how that would have been promulgated would have been a paraphrase coming out as an internal special branch instruction.
So let's look at pages, well, we'll start at the bottom of page 2, paragraph 4, please. Sorry, paragraph 7. In this connection, it may be helpful to remind you of the distinction we draw between subversion and militancy in industrial disputes in the following definitions. Subversion is defined as activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial or violent means. The Harris definition. And then it goes on to say industrial militancy is defined as readiness to use or threaten the use of strikes, sit-ins and other forms of aggressive action in the furtherance of industrial disputes and an unwillingness to seek or accept compromise solutions through negotiations, conciliation or arbitration. And of course it goes on to distinguish the two, one being within limits and one being off limits. Your feeling is that this would have been disseminated not by copying the document but by some other internal special branch communication. Can you recall whether or not you were familiar from 1974 onwards with the Harris definition?
I would like to say yes, sir, but it's one of these things that, with this inquiry and previous inquiries having gone on for so long, whether it's something I picked up as a result of preparing myself for this. I would like to say yes, I did know that, but I can't say it hand on heart.
Well, the next question that comes is, it is different in some significant respects from the definition that we looked at from 1970. Can you recall any instructions or training introducing this refined definition and telling you about it and telling you what changes it should bring about?
No, I can't, sir.
Is that because there wasn't any, or because there might have been, but you can't remember?
Probably the latter, sir.
Now, an important qualification in the Harris definition is it requires not just an intention to overthrow or undermine parliamentary democracy, but there has to be a threat to the safety or well-being of the state. Was there any change on the ground from 1974 onwards as a result of the additional requirement for a group to have not just the intention to overthrow Parliament, but also sufficient potency to threaten the safety or well-being of the state?
I think, as I said earlier, the 80s were a febrile time with industrial unrest, high inflation, and and so on, and lots and lots and lots of street activity and demonstrations so caused. And I would speculate that the activities of the SWP did fulfil that, and fellow travelling organisations did fulfil that definition, and certainly in their minds they were subversive within that definition, I would say. I mean, looking back, they clearly did not fit in with that definition, but that's not how it appeared at the time, to us, or to them, I would suggest. Not sure that answers your question.
Well, let's take on your watch in 1980. Are you asking yourself, are you actually addressing your mind to, does the group my officer is infiltrating not only want to overthrow the state, but actually is threatening the state now?
No, certainly, the one particular branch of the SWP alone could not threaten the state, and that would have been obvious even at that time.
Well, the Special Branch Annual Report say the whole group wasn't either. In fact, the Special Branch Annual Reports describe a lot of groups as posing very little threat.
I haven't seen those reports, so I'm saying that looking backwards, that clearly was the case. I'm not sure whether we on the ground viewed it like that at the time. And certainly the security service didn't, because they were very interested in the work of the SWP and similar groups. They clearly saw them as subversive.
They certainly did. The other change is by adding the rider by political, industrial or violent means. Was that more by way of clarification of existing understanding, or was that something new? If you don't,
What, the addition of the word violent?
Yeah, the words, no, political, industrial or violent means. Was that a clarification that changed the previous understanding? In other words, was a group that was trying to agitate within industry regarded as subversive before the Harris definition?
I would say probably not, sir.
So, whatever the Trotskyist groups were doing in industry in 1971, 1972, are you saying not considered subversive?
I suppose what I'm saying is that the special branches, well, I can only speak for the Met Special Branch, took its lead from the request from the security service, and if they regarded something as subversive, we would have taken our lead from them.
Was there any change in how they regarded a group, which groups they regarded as subversive fundamentally during your time in the 70s in Special Branch?
You'd have to ask them, sir. I don't know the answer to that.
Was it the case, let me put this another way, was it the case that the sort of groups that you and the security service were interested in essentially remained the same throughout the 70s?
Well, I had nothing to do with the SDS in the 70s, so I wasn't even in Special Branch for part of that time, which is perhaps why I'm having difficulty answering your question.
But you were within Special Branch, apart from some time out.
Well, from
for CID.
76 to 80, I wasn't in Special Branch.
So in your time, you're right, it's only fair you can speak to what you know. But was there any change in how the definition was applied or on the ground which groups were of interest between 1968 and 1976?
Not that I was aware of, sir, because I was only on C Squad for a very short time, and for example, for I think 3 years during that time, I was working at Heathrow Airport.
And when you came back to the Special Branch, had anything changed?
I don't know, sir.
Are you certainly in a position, you're not in a position to gainsay the proposition that nothing in fact changed on the ground?
No, I'm not.
Thank you.
but as I was out of the field in that sense for 7 of those years.
Yeah, that's an absolutely fair point to make. I'll have to pick another victim for that. Can we now take that document down and have UCPI 5034701? This is a paper, Home Office paper from 1980. If we could go to page 2, paragraph 4 at the very bottom. It says, this is proposing an amendment to the definition of subversion. And the proposed amended definition starts at the very bottom. Subversive activities are defined as those which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or, thank you, overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial or violent means. Harris, so far. And then this includes the activities of organisations or individuals which, while operating at present within the law, have as a long-term aim the overthrow of parliamentary democracy. So the rider that it was being proposed should be added would make beyond doubt the fact that lawful activity was within the definition of subversion, and all that was required in terms of aim was a long-term aim. Did that in fact reflect what the SDS was doing then anyway?
Yes, I'm not sure I've seen this definition before, this proposed definition, but I would say that it did, yes.
Now, if we can take that down, please. I've been testing your memory back half a century. You've got some, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but some hazy recollections of getting some information and training about these subjects. Looking back, do you think you were sufficiently trained and informed about the definition of subversion?
No, possibly not. I suppose the best training we had on that was with a course provided for junior SB officers by the security service themselves. And that was probably the best training. It could probably have done with re-emphasising, perhaps. I suppose my thoughts are that if the security service came to you and said something was subversive, you took their word for it.
And so far as your men's understanding of subversion is concerned, can I take it from what you've said that you didn't provide them with any formal instruction about the definition or anything like that? You just followed the security service's lead. Do you think they were kept sufficiently up to date or refreshed as to the definition of subversion?
Well, with hindsight, so possibly not. But as I said before, the reporting on subversion defined by the security service was a byproduct, and the main function was not that. And I've come back to that in previous times.
Thank you. And on that note, sir, would it be convenient to break for lunch now?
Certainly it would. Roughly how much longer do you have in this phase of your questioning?
I think I'm on course to finish within the day, sir.
Yes, but that...
I'm halfway through.
Yes, we do, of course, have other questions that may arise from propositions that are put to you by other teams.
I think we're okay, sir.
Good. Very well. Would anybody mind if today, because there may be some pressure of time, we resumed at 2 o'clock rather than 5 past the full hour?
I hear no protest. Then we will resume at 2.